I saw your one this morning about nobody's middle class because everybody's middle class, which I thought was interesting at a time when, unemployment is spiking at the same time as inflation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so the reason the impetus behind that was, you always see those Reddit posts where it's like, I live in New York and I make $800,000 and I am not rich. And, everybody comes for them in the threads. And sure, I mean, I think there is a little bit of like kind of insanity there of like,
there's a flex happening there.
Yeah, like, all right. But at the same time, it does kind of bring up a valid point of like, well, what does it even really mean to be middle class? Like in terms of income, it's so highly dependent on, where you live, but also like, and I kind of touched on this a little bit in my newsletter, but like, it's kind of vibes. Like it's based off of your perception of wealth and what you think wealthy is. So like maybe that person making 800,000 only hangs out with billionaires and therefore thinks that they're not wealthy in comparison. So yeah, it's just very interesting. And it's interesting too, because like, from a policy perspective, you have a lot of politicians that are like, we want the middle class back. Well, who is that really? You could have somebody making $60,000 a year that has phenomenal cash flow. I would say that they're probably in a better position than someone making $100K living paycheck to paycheck, has no savings or no buffer there. So
seen it all.
Interesting. Seen it all. Yeah.
I think it's fun for politicians to say the middle class because it doesn't insult anybody. Like if you're poor, you don't want to think of yourself as poor. If you're wealthy, you don't want people knowing that you're wealthy. And so saying I'm talking to the middle class doesn't offend anybody. When in reality, politicians do mean, I want those of you who can write a check for $100,000 or more to support my campaign to do well so that you can support me in the next cycle. But I also have to include all of your neighbors who feel like they aspirationally can be you someday. And so I'm just going to say middle class, but wink, wink, you know who I'm talking to.
Well, two things. One, I think people who are wealthy, I've heard you can always go backward in terms of like economic association. Like Jensen Huang can always remember being a server at Denny's, but a server at Denny's can't really imagine being Jensen Huang. So it works that way as well. And I think the definition of middle class will need to change. It's not based on income necessarily. It's based on emergency fund and ability to handle like emergency fund and insurance, I would say, is how you would better define if someone's in the middle class.
I think what you just said used to be true, but Donald Trump has proven that a alleged billionaire can actually make the poorest among us feel so much aspiration that they believe this person has their best interest at heart. So somehow he figured out a way to tap into people's emotions of what's been happening thus far isn't working. So I've got to try something new. And I'm going to trust that this guy who flies on a jet with his name on it somehow is going to remember what it's like to be me, even though he's never been me because he grew up rich.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting is that it's all very wrapped up in like the American idea of the meritocracy, right? Where like, and that's why I think a lot of people will defend the presence of billionaires in this country because they want to believe that they could one day be in that place. Because if they, because again, the contract is like, if you work hard, you'll get rewarded for it. And so I actually think that's also why the middle class is a very sympathetic class because, again, it's like this idea of like, okay, if you're successful, that's due to you. If you're not successful, that's also due to you. So you don't hear a lot of talk about like lower income people because there's this, and I'm not saying this is true, obviously, but there's this implicit belief that like, well, if you're struggling financially, you got yourself in that position. But the middle class is like, okay, it's this class, they're pulling themselves out by the bootstraps. And there's, like one of you said, there's this aspirational layer on top of it is like, oh, well, they're just one step away from like reaching that American prosperity.
I'm one parlay away.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. So I think that explains a lot of the behavior that we're seeing in the current economy and like how people are thinking about money.
Hanna Horvath writes Your Brain on Money on Substack. She's a CFP and a managing editor at Bankrate. Thanks for joining us on This Time is Different.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I've enjoyed the conversation so far and realized we should probably tell someone listening who you are. But if you've made it this far through the program, thanks for sticking around and learning who Hanna is. I really enjoy your work on Substack. Malcolm sent it to me, and I think we'll continue to have a good conversation. I think Hanna's a little bit more all in on the AI isn't a circular economy, snake eating its tail thing than you are, though. Which, Hanna, I just talked to Malcolm about it, so we'll have Malcolm give the case, maybe, which is that for the larger hyperscaler, Microsoft, Nvidia, going into Anthropic, maybe not as big of a deal as it is when CoreWeave is doing this in the smaller companies. But is this something you're worried about? Is this large amount of circular deal making among these AI companies?
I think, yes. So just to give a little bit of context about the work that I do is I'm very focused on how these broader economic factors are influencing how people think about their own money and behave with their own money. And so I think the AI quote unquote bubble that we're seeing all these headlines about is very attached to this general feeling that a lot of people are having of this current economy is not working for me. And this feeling like, and I've written a lot about like the K-shaped recovery where the higher income people are doing quite well and the rest of, the country is really struggling financially because of inflation, cost of living crisis, affordability, et cetera. So again, I think this idea of like, okay, there are these people in these boardrooms that are doing these multi-billion-dollar deals, and it kind of just seems like they're passing around money to each other and they're all enriching themselves. Meanwhile, I am struggling day to day. And so like, what does that do to how people think about money in the broader economy? And so that's a lot of what is informing my work.
I think that's incredibly fair. I think with previous industrial revolutions, there have been middle-class jobs that come from that. But when a data center is built in a community, that doesn't necessarily increase jobs permanently. And that's also why you're seeing a lot of communities sort of fighting back saying, hey, why do we want Meta to build a giant data center in this city when it's going to suck up a lot of water? It might increase my electricity bill, and it's not going to create the number of jobs that perhaps a couple of Targets or Walmarts opening up here will.
Definitely.
I think so. I'm going to go super esoteric on this for 1 second. And I know this will never happen in this America, but I would love to see a world where AI actually does replace a lot of human work in a way that allows us to stop thinking and referring to ourselves as jobs. So when politicians talk about how many jobs this data center is going to bring to this town, or how many jobs this new plant that the president forced us to build in the United States is going to bring to this town, or Samsung building washing machines in your town now is going to be a great thing because of all the jobs. There's nothing about the human impact or what's going to be beneficial to you as a human other than there's now some labor for you to do, some hours to trade away for dollars. And I think that one of the things that AI could do in a beautiful way, even though, again, I know this will never happen in this America, is actually replace the mindset of people seeing themselves as jobs or work or salary or income, and instead be thinking about what I can do to occupy my days other than trading hours for dollars.
Yeah. I mean, that's like the very idealistic vision
I
of
know.
all this. But and it is interesting because you'll have these like CEOs that are like, well, you won't have to work as much. And it's like, okay, well, we live in like a deeply capitalistic country that, like you just said, completely conflates purpose and identity with output and work. And so I find it very hard to believe that there would be a world in which, we would allow people to not have to work all the time, even with the addition of AI. And we already have such, this country is so heavily individualistic. You need to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That's why, compared to other developed countries, we have such a scant social safety net, for example. So again, it's like, well, I mean, like it would be amazing. And that's why I always find it very ironic when, you'll see these tech CEOs like saying stuff like that, where it's like, well, is that really what you want? Is that really what you think is going to happen? Maybe it's just they're trying to sell it to everybody else.
So here's the quote from Elon Musk. Quote, "My prediction is that work will be optional. It'll be like playing sports or a video game or something like that. If you want to work, the same way you can go to the store and just buy some vegetables, or you can grow vegetables in your backyard. It's much harder to grow vegetables in your backyard. And some people still do it because they like growing vegetables." I don't know if that metaphor holds. I think I'm more in the Hanna camp that there's going to continue to be. I don't think AI can replace all work, and it makes the human work, like teaching, plumbing, physical things that are not going to be easily replicated by robotics and AI in the next 5, 10, 20 years, probably. I think it makes it even more important as all of this stuff comes into play.
Yeah. And I'll also just add 2 things. One, it's like, okay, so like if work did become optional, are you going to feed people? Like, are we going to like where are people going to get kind of like their daily needs met?
Well, this is where the universal basic income meets the Mamdani effect of we're going to have government-sponsored grocery stores and government-sponsored transportation and government-sponsored blah, 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 blah. So I think you have to marry those 2 things together because the AI came along and took our jobs, and now everybody's, So there has to be the penance for allowing AI to take all the good jobs is the government has to also step in and provide quality healthcare, transportation, universal basic income, all those things that will make a capitalist turn this podcast off and say,
yeah,
I've had enough.
Yeah. And I mean, as far as we've seen, there's no market incentive to do that. So like in our country, it's typically when there's no market incentive to do something, it very rarely gets done, at least on a wide scale. So it kind of all remains to be seen. But I mean, I do think a big part of the current economy and like market is fear. And so I do think that, we can't predict the future, but I do think a lot of people's reactions are based on the headlines that are very much fear driven. And so I think that explains a lot of how people are reacting to things right now.
So from an AI perspective, though, do you think from the reading, writing, and reporting that you've been doing specifically on that topic, and you talk a lot about younger people specifically, do you think that Gen Z views AI any differently as a cohort than older people? And when I say older, I mean like myself, I'm 38. When people like us who've been conditioned to think about work differently and think about our place in the work world differently than people maybe like sub 25, do you think that their approach and expectations and everything else around AI skews any differently?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things happening. Gen Z is the first like digitally native generation. So I do think that they are using AI generally in much larger numbers than like other generations are. They're just adapting to these tools much faster, I would say, than like, Gen X boomers. However, I do think it is really fundamentally reshaping how they're thinking about career and work and purpose. And there's a bunch of different things happening. But essentially, your young people are going to school, they're getting these degrees, they're graduating, and they're watching how rapidly everything is changing. Like, these careers that they thought they were going to have is like obsolete or like becoming obsolete. And again, I think the younger generation specifically, I think really feels the nihilism around the American dream of like, this old script is no longer working. And so as I've written about in my newsletter a lot, there's a bunch of different responses that young people have had to this economic reality, which is one of them is like, I say entrepreneurship as salvation. So it's like the grind culture, the hustle culture, and all those like AI startups just embracing that change and trying to get an edge there. You also see it in people that are joining the casino economy and gambling, betting on like meme stocks, prediction markets, and just that sense of like, this is the only way to actually build wealth because working a 9 to 5 is not going to get me there. And then the third thing is really just like nihilism and apathy. And it's like, what's the point of doing anything? What's the point of saving for anything when the world is going to be like, just, we don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. And all of that is having a very tangible impact on the economy. And I would argue not probably in the most positive way. And so I think it's important to like understand like, yes, this is a somewhat rational response by young people to the current environment that they're in. So, and using that to understand like what direction the economy is going to be headed in the next few years.
I think this started a while ago too. I think this isn't a new phenomenon. I think those working in a corporate job may have had this feeling. You graduate from college, you feel idealistic, you're ready to go into a corporation, you're going to make change by working hard, you're going to build financial independence for yourself. And then you're there for a year or two, and then you talk to your coworkers and you realize, wait a second, if I do really well, maybe I'm going to get a 3 to 5% raise per year. Am I going to ever be able to afford a house? And then your mindset changes to, maybe apathy, where you're thinking, okay, well, if that's the case, how does this deal change? I'm not getting a pension. I get a 401k. If I put in a ton of effort here, I can get maybe a cost of living adjustment, maybe a promotion in 3 to 5 years, which is a little bit better. But you start seeing the math play out in a way where you go, okay, I'm going to do a good job. I'm going to be a professional, but I'm not going to put my nose to the grindstone in a way that my parents' generation may have when they had a different deal with their employers.
Yeah. And just to add that, using that same example, you're also going online and seeing people your age with claiming that they have millions of dollars doing this, doing this grift online or having this business online. And like, obviously we can talk about how it's so easy to fake this kind of stuff online. But again, over time, your brain starts to normalize this and you think, oh, like all these other people are, beating the game. Well, I'm stuck in this like 9 to 5 job that I'm not getting a ton of fulfillment out of. And again, I think that's like we see that response really play out in how a lot of young people are thinking about career.
You know what I'm seeing from the outside in that's helping to have that effect? And I'm glad that you mentioned it because I think anecdotally people might know that it exists, but I have tangible evidence seeing it where I sit on a daily basis, talking to people in their 70s and 80s that are actually transitioning this wealth to their next generation. There's a lot we talk all the time about the great wealth transfer that's expected to happen 2040, 2045, 2050, whatever that number is, when boomers are supposed to all pass away on the same day and leave trillions of dollars in wealth to their next generations. I'm seeing a lot of living inheritances happening now, which is great in the sense that you're helping. This is something I encourage clients in that cohort to do. Give the money to your people now when it'll actually have the most impact, right? If I'm 25 years old, 35 years old, trying to start my life, giving me $50,000, $100,000 toward buying my first house now will have a massive impact on my life compared to me inheriting that money when I'm 50 or 60. And, at that point, if I haven't bought a house, I've probably decided I don't want to. So those are the kinds of things that are happening. And that's what's getting misrepresented online a lot of times. So people who are doing the flexing that you're talking about are doing it with mom and dad's money. Nothing wrong with that, right? Like that is what generational wealth, when we use that term, is supposed to actually mean and be and feel like. However, it's just being misrepresented. And that's what's helping to convince people that they aren't hustling hard enough, when in reality, they were just born to the wrong family or at the wrong time. And that's their biggest sin, is not being born to parents who are well enough off to hand them that kind of cash on a monthly basis to subsidize their lifestyle.
And I always say that wealth is relative. Like, there's no one true definition of like what is wealthy. So if you are, a millionaire hanging out with billionaires, like you're not going to feel wealthy. And so I think, our reference group of what we're seeing as wealth is so vastly expanded because of social media and the internet. And so it's so easy for us to get a very distorted perception of how much money somebody should have in order to live like a quote unquote good life. Like, I'm not saying this isn't impossible for people, but statistically, becoming a multi-millionaire, it's not, there's a reason why it's like the top 1%. That means there's 99 other people that are not going to get there. And I'm not saying you can't have a good financial life not being a multi-millionaire, but it's just being more realistic with yourself and understanding like, oh no, this is not the norm,
You can have a really good life not being a multi-millionaire. You wouldn't say it, I'll say it. Because I'd say that in all seriousness, because I meet people on a regular basis. We have clients that have $5-10 million, even sometimes more, saved and still feel like they don't have enough. And these are people that don't and won't spend a dime because they've convinced themselves that they have to amass this giant pot of money to feel like they've won the game, or to feel the safety that comes along with having that kind of net worth. And two things. One, it sucks because you miss out on a lot of life by hoarding capital that way. And what I mean by that is not that you shouldn't have millions of dollars, but I mean that, to me, money is meant to be used as a tool to help improve our overall quality of life. To me, that's what I want money for. And so if I'm not using it to help improve my quality of life, and instead I'm driving myself crazy every time I see the value of my net worth go down by 10 cents, it's actually having the opposite effect on me. The other side of that is, at whatever point I leave this earth, I'm going to leave those dollars to people who will not appreciate them to the level that I did, as the people who didn't actually spend the time accumulating them, which means that it also was for naught. Because sometimes we convince ourselves that we're doing this for our kids, we're doing this for our next generation, we're doing this to build generational wealth, but we're not actually passing along the wisdom needed to help manage those assets, which means that wealth isn't going to last for generations anyway. So I might as well have just bet it all on a parlay and had some fun.
Yeah. In my newsletter, I read a lot about like how we perceive earned versus inherited wealth. And we perceive it quite differently. Like you just said, there's a very tangible difference between like a dollar that you worked hard for versus a dollar that someone just gave you. And so that all shapes how people decide to spend it and save it, etc. And I completely agree with any type of money behavior that is like deeply wrapped up in your sense of self is typically not that healthy. And so I think, if you take a movement like the FIRE movement, there's nothing inherently wrong with the FIRE movement. It prioritizes saving, building up your money for, more flexibility later in life. But what will sometimes happen with people that practice FIRE is saving becomes part of their identity. And so then it's very difficult for them to shift, because like when you're going from, accumulating to retirement, that's a big identity shift a lot of times. And so I think a lot of people struggle with that piece because they haven't built that like healthy relationship with money. And it's so tied up with how they perceive themselves that it's hard for them to kind of shift away from that.
The phrase that I've seen that I always apply to this is, if you are insecure about money, more money is not going to change that. It's more of an education thing, an education that has to be had around money and also what drives your feelings on it. But people think that because they are insecure about money, they just need to accumulate more money, which couldn't be further from the truth.
I completely agree. I mean, I even like with my own financial journey in my like early to mid 20s, if you don't know what you want money to do for you, if you don't know what you value, you're going to end up living someone else's life, or you're going to use your money to live someone else's life, or what other people value. And that will drive that discontentedness. And I completely agree that, so many people struggle with money anxiety and just feeling that sense of lack with money. And then they equate it to, I need more money, instead of, what am I actually spending my money on? Is it actually aligned with things that I care about? And, obviously there are situations where, yeah, maybe having more money would get you to that, the next level of life satisfaction. But a lot of times too, it is like you're just spending money on things that are just not improving your quality of life or making you feel content.
I want to go to big story too, because I think we're seeing a massive shift in, I would say, politics, and this is the economy as well. I would say the last Trump election, the biggest issue was immigration. I think the biggest story now is affordability. And you write that affordability is the issue. Politicians who lose sight of that will lose. I think this is going to be very interesting because we have essentially two parties. One where they don't really have a lot to say about affordability, in my view. And then the second party, which is they have a lot of ideas of building brand new systems to address affordability, but many of those systems have been historically very ineffective. This is the kind of the abundance idea, but also you look at something like the rural broadband build out that was supposed to happen under the Biden administration, but they put up so much bureaucracy and red tape that it really, I don't think it really happened anywhere, despite the billions and billions that were promised for that. So, Hanna, I'm curious for your perspective on this, because it seems like this is the number one issue, and it is. I'm not saying immigration is easy or kind to solve, but it is more solvable by a government force with, brutal and lawfare tactics ish.
Yeah. So I wrote about this in my newsletter. And just to give it a context, I live in New York. And I completely agree that, like, yes, what Zoran's win, really crystallized is that affordability, like this current economy is not working for people, and people are struggling with affordability. I would actually argue that Trump's platform did center on affordability. However, his solution for that was to focus on immigration. And so I actually think he won the same reason why Zoran won in New York. They have vastly different platforms and solutions on how to get there, but they were addressing the same pain point that people were having, which is, I do not feel like this is working for me. I do agree with you in that affordability is very hard to define, because what do you mean? What is unaffordable? And are we talking about housing? Are we talking about food? Are we talking about just overall cost of things? So I think that makes it tricky to nail down. And actually in my newsletter, I talked about so a lot of people are starting to sour on the idea of capitalism. And, Zoran is a Democrat socialist. And so clearly that, to me, is a signal of people are interested in what other economic models are out there to potentially help this world that we're currently living in. And so in my newsletter, I talk a lot about the downsides, but also the upsides of a capitalism system, what other economic models could work, et cetera. I do agree with you that just given our current culture, we live in a very individualistic culture, as I said, I don't ever see capitalism being done away with, and then we have full socialism. Though I know there's a lot of people online that are arguing that we're going to go full socialist. I don't think that's going to happen, nor do I even think that necessarily should happen. Our country is so huge and diverse. And I also think, having the government, like you just said, take over these vast, very large industries could be a challenge. However, I do think that there is some room and space for better conversation between these two economic systems, and just a better way of thinking about things. And the example I gave actually was, public or private government partnerships. If you think about the COVID vaccine, if you think about the internet, those were partnerships that were subsidized by the government, but run by private companies. And so those are great examples of what happens when you kind of marry these two things together. And I think all of this is to say is people clearly are fed up with the current system and they want something new. And I think, Zoran has a lot of different ideas to get there. Not all of them are going to work, but I do think people like the idea of let's just try something, because what is happening is not working for us.
Ricky, I think Hannah's helping make my case for a three-party system in this country, but I'll leave that for a different day. Are you ready
to join Elon Musk's third party that he started floating? I mean,
America first.
You're already with him on AI preventing the need for jobs in the future. And now you're with him on the three-party system. I feel like you two would be good friends.
While he also builds his robot army.
Well, he builds. And Hanna, this is something I thought was very surprising, is that Gen Z is now evenly split on socialism and capitalism. And I think that's going to be one of the greater political and economic forces that's already here. I mean, we got a question on the show about a week ago that was, what does Zoran Mamdani mean for markets? And Malcolm and I were kind of like, there's some real estate REITs. There's some New York REITs, excuse me, that have been affected, but it's hard to say. Maybe my mind's wavering on that a little bit, because I do think that this is going to be one of a more significant force. It's just starting in New York City right now.
Yeah. Well, so I'll start by saying to what you're saying about young people being split. Another poll had young people define what they thought socialism meant. And a lot of them actually did not adopt the traditional definition of socialism, which is, the government controlling specific industries. And I think they saw it more as like building a better social safety net. And I think a lot of people are also not aware that there are actually currently socialist practices in the United States, like our trash collection, that kind of, that is traditionally a socialist practice, because it's government controlled.
When the president of the United States says we are going to invest U.S. dollars into publicly traded companies, and in exchange for that, we want our quote unquote golden share, that is directly ripped from the CCP's playbook. And that term golden share has been used by the Chinese government several times in the last year alone. So when you talk about socialism right there in plain sight and people not necessarily recognizing that it's happening in front of them, that is the perfect example to me.
Yeah, like the Trump administration buying the 10% stake in Intel. Like, that's socialism. That is literal socialism. Like, I think it just goes to show that like these terms get thrown around a lot without like a full understanding of like what they actually mean. And I do think it kind of comes back to, I try to focus on like the feelings. And it's like the feeling of like, this is not working. We want government support to help us live, like baseline, like to give us that foundation that we can then build upon. I don't think many people would argue against some of the innovative features of capitalism. I would argue that innovation is like one of the United States' best exports. And I don't think many people would want that to go away, though I know Trump is like advocating for manufacturing to have a comeback. But, I do think the average person would argue for that. So I do hopefully we'll see some sort of hybrid between the two that kind of allows for that market innovation, but provides a little bit more of a safety net where people don't feel like, because if there isn't a safety net, that does lead to a level of risk aversion, which can stifle innovation.
I think it's worth mentioning too, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
Yes.
It's more than 40% of government expenditures right now. And, let's say two out of those three, not even let's say, 2 out of those 3 are for an older generation. And I think something interesting kind of cracked during COVID as well, which is that a lot of younger people were asked to make sacrifices during the COVID era. We need you to stay at home. We need you to do things to protect an older generation. And I think part of that, there's an implicit agreement, which is, hey, you're gonna take care of me a little bit later down the road. And this is, I don't know how much, if this is true, but it feels true to me. So younger people were asked to make a tremendous sacrifice. We'll take care of you down the road a little bit. Now that that's been over for a few years, it's like, wait a second. We're not getting taken care of at all. Housing's more expensive. Everything got more expensive. We've seen, education delays, career delays, all of this stuff. And there's a sense of frustration and anger that part of the bargain wasn't held up when in previous crises, when younger people made a real sacrifice. I'm not saying that staying home from school is the same as World War II, but you get home loans that are subsidized. There's something on the other end to help improve your future after you've made a personal or economic sacrifice for the good of society.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is deep, deep resentment between young people and the older generation. I think a lot of young people feel like, boomers, to kind of throw them under the bus, built this entire world of wealth and then just pulled the ladder right up behind them.
Dare I say a bubble?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, and I think you'll get a lot of these interactions where it's like, well, I just don't understand why young people can't X, Y, Z. And so much of that is due to a lack of genuine understanding about the economic environment that they're operating in. And, it's like this idea, and it all kind of feeds back to this like meritocracy where it's like, well, if I could do it, so could you. And so much of actually like my writing is very much like writing about how you have agency in your finances and like things you can do to build wealth, but also very much recognizing the structural forces around you. And I think that's lacking from a lot of, older people talking about the younger generation. It's this idea, like, it's almost like they're ignoring all of the structural factors and are like, why don't you just like work harder and then you can buy a house? And, and actually I was reading such an interesting article the other day that I mentioned in my newsletter this morning. It very much how like baby boomers are kind of refusing to let go. They're staying in their jobs like well past retirement age. They're not leaving their homes. They're like locked into these amazing mortgages. They refuse to leave. So it's like leading to this like stagnation in the broader market where, when somebody doesn't like leave their home, for example, that, that kind of prevents people or like a younger person from buying that house, for example. So it's just like another small piece of this feeling that these kind of two groups have against each other.
So then how do you, we've talked about the reasons with well-founded reason of why you would feel cynical and upset about your place in the economy. Hanna, you're a CFP. I know you talk to people about helping, build a more secure financial future. What do you do if you're feeling that way? You're in your late 20s, early 30s. How do you build more agency into your financial life?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is like, have a little self-compassion, like understand that all these forces are going on in your life and you're just one person operating in them. And I don't pretend to know, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't pretend to know what's going to happen in the future. And like, anybody that's telling you that they do is not someone worth listening to. But I'm a big proponent, especially in a period of economic certainty, kind of like what we're in now, is building optionality, is building flexibility in your budget. And so looking at your finances and thinking about your liquidity. And I'm not saying, okay, I'm going to go cash out all of my stocks, but it's just thinking like, if XYZ happened, do I have the kind of means to make a pivot? Maybe that means building multiple streams of income so you're not just reliant on one thing. Maybe that's improving your cash flow. I think cash flow is a big thing too when you're thinking about, just having more optionality, is what I'd recommend. And also like, understand like the context that you're operating in. But I mean, especially when it comes to investing, I think investing is a game that you have to try to take emotions out as much as possible. And so assuming you have a financial plan, it's just really about sticking to it and feeling confident in it. And I will say, like young people especially, they started their careers and have largely worked in a bull market. So they don't have the experience going through a bear market. And I'm not saying necessarily we're going to go through a bear market, but if we did, it's like understanding like that's going to be a time where I have to really deal with my emotions and kind of hunker down there.
So I think one of the things that is interesting as you guys are talking about what should younger people be doing, I'm hearing you talk about building up a financial safety net in the sense that I'm putting some cash to the side basically to buffer against that future downturn that one day inevitably is going to come. We have no idea when, but it's going to come at some point because it always has to. But what second piece of that is investing in such a way that like your dollars can grow. And I actually think that one thing that gets glossed over when we talk about younger people specifically is we tend to think about investing in ourselves as a thing that stops the moment we leave the university. So either I go get a bachelor's degree or I go get a master's or maybe a PhD. And in that sense, I'm done investing in my education, which means I'm done investing in my higher ability or whatever the word I'm supposed to use there actually is. But when you said something about creating optionality for yourselves, that's what came to mind for me. Like we'll spend tens of thousands of dollars to go to university, then not spend any money to teach ourselves how to manage the money that degree was supposed to allow us to go and command. And then also stop investing in ourselves to become more employable as time goes on. And I think this is an economy where you absolutely cannot afford to miss that last piece, right? So we always argue that whether AI is actually coming to take people's jobs or if instead of being replaced by the technology, it's the people who understand the technology who are more likely to come and take your job, right? And I think it's the latter. And so if I'm a person in my 20s right now who's thinking, what can I do to help guard myself against all of these crises that we just got done talking about that might potentially be coming for you, but realistically will probably hit you in some different way that's somewhere in the middle between the rosy scenario and the doom and gloom. The most important or most impactful thing you could be doing is investing in your understanding of AI so that when you do sit in an interview, you can, oh, by the way, I happen to be that person who understands AI and understands how to infuse it into this job that I'm sitting here talking to you about. And that's the thing that's going to separate me from everyone else and make me extremely employable and in demand, which is job security in a way.
I completely agree. I think that's such a good point. And like, if you're 30 years old, you have potentially 30, 35 years left in your career.
50, but go on.
Well, that's my point. You have decades. And, it's like I would say largely the era of working at the same company for 40 years is over. So you are going to have a bunch of shifts throughout your career if you are 30 years old. So you need to understand that is a reality. You could have a bunch of career pivots. And like you said, like building in those skills, it's like this continuous, you should be on a continuous learning trajectory because the world is rapidly changing. The jobs that we have right now could be completely different in 5 years. And so, like while we can't predict everything, like you said, like just staying on top of the new technologies, paying attention to like the direction that things are going, because you can start to read the tea leaves a little bit about where companies are investing, where they're not investing, et cetera.
So one of the things, I've recently been through a career pivot, and the thing I want to add to that is when I did that, I was working on a podcast as a full-time job, and I got to a place where I'm like, all right, I need to get out of this thing. And the thing that allowed me to make that pivot, well, number one, I had a good amount of savings. My wife works full-time, so you can stretch things a little bit. But one of the mistakes I made, I think, is as I was making that pivot, is I was like, I'm going to reinvent myself and do something that is completely new. And because I need to be agile and change what I'm doing. The mistake that I made, though, is I forgot about what I'm good at. So I think as you're thinking about building a career and making those pivots, you need to be able to take in new skills, but you can't ignore what got you to the place that you were. And you need to be able to mix that. And I know it's kind of heady, but like mixing that with what you're already good at versus maybe constantly trying to reinvent yourself into something that's completely new.
I completely agree. All of those things should be kind of building up off of each other.
This episode is sponsored by Capital Area Planning Group. Capital Area Planning Group is a fiduciary wealth management firm that specializes in helping high net worth individuals and families navigate the complexities that come along with managing concentrated stock options, multiple income streams, and an ever-changing tax code. While our team of certified financial planners are well-versed in all things personal finance, our areas of expertise include equity compensation, estate planning, and multi-year tax planning. At Capital Area Planning Group, we believe in pricing transparency. That's why our fees are posted on our website, right alongside the various services we perform on behalf of our clients throughout the year. If you're tired of receiving the same cookie-cutter advice from your financial advisor, then don't wait. Reach out to us today at capgllc.com to experience a better approach to wealth management. Again, that web address is www.capgllc.com.
And Hannah, something I also want to hit that you've been writing about as we're getting into this holiday season is sort of this mass erosion of empathy. You say that has come from convenience culture, the ability that I've enjoyed of being able to get things delivered to my house in 24 hours from Amazon. I think there's a tremendous benefit of this, but also you talk about some of the downsides.
Yeah. So in that newsletter, I was talking about, this broader consumerist convenience culture that we're all in. It's been easier than ever before to buy something and have it come as quickly as humanly possible. And so because of that, our expectations for how quickly things should be done have gone up exponentially. And that bleeds into all areas of our life, including our interactions with other people. And I think, and I wrote about how when you spend money on something, you have a sense of ownership over the outcome of it, right? Like you're like, oh, I have skin in the game now. And so again, like happiness is really the gap between your expectations and what actually happens. So if your expectations are not met, you typically will become unhappy. And I think people's threshold for expectations it's gone up exponentially. And so the kind of victims of all this tend to be service workers, and I think we have no shortage of videos online of people harassing service workers or just being very cruel to them when they don't get what they want exactly when they want it. I also used to be a service worker, and a huge thing I was struck by in my job is just how dehumanizing it is and how people really tend to see you as a means to get the thing that they paid for. So I think a lot of what I caution is like, do we need that thing to come in 24 hours? Like, do you need your Starbucks drink made in 30 seconds? Is there a possible way where you could take a step back and slow down and understand that like there are human beings often on the other ends of these things? And, I'm trying to think of the exact line I said in my newsletter. Something like, we've started to expect perfection from these like imperfect systems that are run by humans. And so just finding ways to lower your expectations a little bit and all of that.
Well, this is why AI is coming for the jobs, because you want to not be perfect every time you make that super duper complicated drink at Starbucks, and the robot can do it with a smile. But I find it weird when service workers abuse service workers, right? Like one thing that I think is really interesting about like the restaurant community, for example, is I've learned that like servers, bartenders, hosts, whatever from restaurants that are geographically close to one another will go and hang out after their shift together, or they'll come eat at each other's restaurants or sit at the bar and have drinks. And so everybody like knows everybody as part of the quote unquote community. And I've seen where that even is starting to erode, and where like a person who works at Burger King down the street will come into the Chick-fil-A and yell at the person behind the counter who has the exact same job that they have, and then go clock into that job and get yelled at by people from somewhere else. Like that's the absurdity.
It's probably that repression where it's like you're getting yelled at all day, and then you have that built up frustration. You just want to yell at somebody else. I mean, I think all of this, as I wrote in a newsletter, it contributes to like a lower trust society. And when you have like a robot, or even like, I even point out like self-checkout, that like even just like because you're losing that human connection, that erodes our like trust in our society and how we relate to one another. And so I find myself very intentionally forcing myself to interact with other humans. Like even if the self-checkout line is completely empty, I will go and I'll wait for a cashier. And yeah, it is like wildly inconvenient and annoying a lot of times, but it forces you to be out in the world, and it makes you more empathetic and understanding of other people. And I think that is really important. I mean, we live in like a loneliness epidemic. Like we need to be talking more and more involved in our local communities.
Well, two things. One, Malcolm, I think what you're seeing is that hurt people. And while it ends up being true, and to Hannah, to what you're saying, I think one of the things I know I've lost and I'm trying to regain while working from home is those soft social interactions that you don't realize how much of that has an impact on you just by, noticing people in a coffee shop or people in an office you have to say good morning to, even if you don't particularly like them. You lose all of that when you're working from home. And I recognize we're close to the end of our time together. One of the pieces of advice I really liked that you wrote, and normally we're talking about finance stuff on the show. This is almost the opposite of that, but I think it's incredibly important, is that, you suggest that we need to find non-consumer sources of meaning. It's about identifying what actually satisfies you versus what temporarily distracts you, relationships that require showing up, skills that take time to develop. And I really liked this creativity without an audience. That last part is someone who is trying to start a new podcast is something I definitely struggle with. But I know is important. Is there any way that you've been trying to practice this in your own life?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'll say is I actually would argue that this is a financial problem because lonely consumers are better consumers. When you're lonely or emotionally dysregulated, it's a lot easier for you to be marketed to. So building community actually typically will be better for your finances. As someone who struggles with productivity guilt, this has been kind of a huge goal of mine personally, to find new ways to engage with the world and create something without it being directly monetizable. So I'm actually learning to play the harmonica. So that's what I'm also trying to do like screenless hobbies, because I was finding that my hobbies were like going from one screen to another screen. So I was desperately trying to look for ways that didn't involve that. I wouldn't play for you guys right now because I'm quite bad, but I'll check back in a couple months.
Well, the harmonica is one of those things that is subjective too, right? Like you can be good or terrible at the harmonica, and the margin between the two to my ears is fairly close. Like nobody knows.
I don't think you've heard me play yet. You would know. You'd be like, this is not good.
Malcolm, I don't think you're getting a harmonica solo to end this podcast.
No, I'm sorry.
But I am a person who tends to think they're good at a lot of things they've never done. But I feel like if I picked one up right this moment, I would sound like Stevie Wonder on that thing. Like it can't be that challenging compared to other instruments that you really have to spend 10 hours a day to get good at.
I do think it is easier to learn. Maybe I'm just not musically inclined. But
yeah, I'm saying that as you're the one who's actually practicing it, and
I'll come back on in 6 months and we can end the episode with a solo.
Tune back in next week. Malcolm's going to show all of our listeners how easy it is to master the harmonica and play really well. Hanna Horvath, she writes Your Brain on Money on Substack. Anything else you want to plug? Anything coming up? Or
no, for now, just kind of enjoying the rest of the year. I'm writing a lot more about consumer culture with Black Friday coming up, so just stay tuned for that.
Cool. Appreciate the time. Thanks for being here.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Information shared in this recording and by its guests represent the views and opinions of the guests and does not represent the views or opinions of the host. This content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. This content is not, nor is it intended to be, a substitute for professional financial advice. It is always recommended that you seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your personal financial situation.